Walk the Talk America presents Guns and Mental Health, a podcast for firearms owners, clinicians, and the curious public.
Good morning, everyone. I'm taking the seat today as Mike got in a little late from a trip back east, and so I'll be running the conversation with Rob. Rob's going to talk red flag laws, and where this conversation kind of rooted was we've seen some organizations, I think 97% say, I believe it's 72% of gun owners support red flag laws. And even in our data that we got almost 2,500 respondents, we had 40% say that they were a supporter of ERPOs or red flag laws. And we want to dive in. In the next survey, we want to ask why of both sides, of why do they not agree and why do they agree. But we're going to talk with Rob of why he thinks that is. So Rob, what's your kind of thoughts when you hear that statistic and that number?
Oh, wow. Well, good morning. That's a big question.
Good morning.
Right?
Should probably be the first
probably
thing.
Already in the chat comments. Good morning. There's people that are like, red flag laws suck, ERPOs are infringements. And yeah, the red flag laws that we have across the country pretty much suck. And infringements, we fight infringements every day at all levels of gun ownership and that disrespect, I guess, for responsible gun ownership and the work that we do, including a lot of the work that we do here at WTTA, obviously. And I was surprised, given our audience, the WTTA audience, that we got 40% favorable attitude towards ERPOs, towards red flag laws, just without asking any other qualifiers, right? Without having to say with due process, whatever that means to the individual hearing it, or if mental health care was provided to respondents or anything else. There's no quality numbers, much larger numbers of gun owners supporting red flag laws in other surveys that are done. And I'm always skeptical of, which gun owners they're talking to or how the question was worded. But in our own work, we see that this is not quite, it's not a majority, but it's significant portion of the population. Well, one of the questions that gets asked a lot outside of the gun world from people who really have an interest in reducing negative outcomes with guns is, why don't gun owners generally support red flag laws? Or asked another way, what changes need to be made to get more gun owners to support these red flag laws? I think to have that conversation, a couple of things. We have to be willing to look away from the red flag laws that exist now. 14 states, however many states it is, these what I would consider antiquated approaches to trying to figure out how to use the power of the government to restrict someone's access to firearms because they may be a danger to themselves or others, but they have not yet committed a crime, right? That's the thin slice we're dealing with. Very thin slice, in my opinion. Former law enforcement, we know we have involuntary, we have restraining orders as an option. There are other things we can do when someone makes overt threats to themselves or others, when someone makes it very clear to law enforcement that they're not processing information the world around them in a sustainable way. You get them in for a mental health evaluation, the involuntary commitment 5150 Baker Act, depends on the state how that's worded. So if we take the premise, we need something, which I don't necessarily agree with, right? Because I know that these other options exist. I know that the gun community does a lot. I know that wealth in general and taking care of each other. I sort of reject the premise that we need this. What I don't reject, however, is the reality that these are probably coming in more states in the future. And if we're going to have something under this umbrella that we call red flag laws, how can we make them better? And I know you guys have talked about this internally too, right, Kevin?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the data points that we got back. Can you hear me? I can see you. Are you good?
Yeah.
Okay. That was something we talked about internally of, wow, that's higher than we expected. What is the reason for that? And we kind of thought of like, when Megan Rainey was on the stage with Mike, she presented red flag laws in the best case magical scenario of where some horrific incident was potentially likely to happen, and removing access from that firearm saved so many lives, and the crowd enjoyed that. And then Mike presented the other kind of perspective of, hey, that's great. Everybody wants firearms out of someone that's going to do the hands of someone that's going to do some horrific act. But I live in a world where red flag laws might get people killed by the preventing them from seeking care and the unintended consequences. So you're right. What's the next step? Is there so much support for something? And maybe it's my marketing brain and business background that I don't want anything to say, call it red flag laws or ERPO. I want something totally new if we're going to propose something. So that way, if other states are like, oh, this state's having success with this new one, it's not, oh, this new red flag law, and then they take other pieces of other red flag laws. So let's call it something totally different and build some other option that's not connected with red flag or ERPOs.
Right. So if you know, as a board member of WTTA, if something were going to be presented to us and the question on the table is, do we support this? Like, is Rob going to vote in favor of this thing? There's a gray area for me with the marketing piece. What I don't want to do is open ourselves up to being called, you know, well, it's a red flag law, you're just calling it something else. I think that's really important. We're not talking about the red flag laws that have existed. I would like to see them evolved. I'd like to see them changed, and maybe focusing on what those points are is how we get to what is this other thing, you know, and I use the term like emergency intervention. We got this emergency intervention by the government. It's not a criminal process, it's a civil process. And that speaks a little bit to this idea of due process. That's one of the big complaints, right? There's no due process. There is due process, even in existing red flag laws. Do I think it goes far enough? Personally, no. I don't think we're protecting the civil right enough. And I don't think we're certainly doing anything to address the underlying issues enough with existing red flag laws. So what are some things we might have? Well, one of the things that I've always advocated for is a mandatory mental health evaluation to go along with the serving of the ERPO or the red flag. I think it's important for a couple of things. First of all, if we're saying this person needs an intervention, well, then presumably they need mental health, even if it's like calm down, right? Like calm down is mental health. I think at its lowest level. If we think about physical health and mental health in the same way, we know that, you know, there might be, I'm going to take aspirin, and then there's, I need surgery when it comes to physical health, right? Mental health is the same thing. Like calm down, breathe, take a second to process what's going on before you say you're going to kill yourself, before you say you're going to kill that MFer down the street. Just breathe, you know? And if that's the intervention that's needed, well, okay, we've done that. Now, presumably, obviously, we're talking about things that need more intervention than that. But if it doesn't rise to the level of an involuntary commitment, I still think we should have this mental health evaluation as part of it. Now, people get into HIPAA and privacy rights and all these things, but we have to remember we're starting at the point of taking away someone's civil rights. We're going to take away their access to firearms. We're going to take away their Second Amendment rights. We're already in the realm of interfering in this person's life in a way that I think the mental health evaluation is important. And there's also a little bit of a political piece to that for me. Because if we have a mandatory mental health evaluation that goes along with every red flag that gets served over a period of time, a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is, we're going to have a body of data. Everybody wants to say evidence-based practices, right? Like, does the research justify taking these actions in these cases? Well, let's collect some data. If what we find, right, if we go to 90% of the mental health evaluation say, yeah, this person is a danger to themselves or others right now, and we need this intervention, and that's the report that goes to the court. That's interesting, right? Now we start to think, well, maybe we need to be going into involuntary commitments more often. What if it's the other way? What if it's 90% of the time, the mental health professional comes in, talks to the person and says, I don't get it. Like this person does not represent a danger to themselves or others from a mental health aspect. And there's no reason from my perspective that you should be infringing on their civil rights. Well, now we know that turns out the gun community was right all along, and these things are being used when they shouldn't be used. And we're restricting people's civil rights unfairly and without justification. And I think those two data points are important, right?
Absolutely. I just wanted to ask a question. How would you maybe remove liability for those mental health professionals that are giving that evaluation? I know working with the Armory Project in Louisiana, they've done a lot of great work having FFLs not have liability for giving firearms that they're temporarily storing for individuals back to that individual too soon, too early, or anything like that. How would you remove any hesitations or that from a mental health professional that feels like there's a lot more riding on that examination than just somebody coming in having some stress in their life or something like that?
Easy answer, I don't know. Right. That's a policy issue and a professional licensing issue and a professional liability issue that I have to imagine is already addressed in some ways in the mental health profession. Right. I know that I've heard mental health professionals express that concern. I don't know if we give them blanket, like if the government calls upon you to do this and you imagine they're getting paid. We've proposed in some policy discussion this idea of a percentage of the sales tax collected from the sale of guns and ammunition goes to fund these mental health evaluations potentially. However, it's getting funded. They're getting paid to do their job. They're licensed to this that they've signed up for. No one's compelling them to do it, I'm sure. So they're saying, I'll do it. And they have to be willing to either put that under their professional liability insurance or under whatever rules they've gotten against. So I have to assume as someone who's not involved in that space that there's some aspect of that being covered already. But let's say there's not. Who's our friend up in Jersey? Gianni?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Gianelli?
the book on it.
You know what I'm talking about? The guy who wrote the book on firearms and health.
Yep.
Gianelli. So he has gone into this because the state of New Jersey was going to mental health professionals and saying, we need to know if you think this person should be allowed to have a gun or not. And he's looking around like, I was never trained to make that determination. I don't know anything about whether that's okay or not. Right. And enter Walk Talk America with our cultural competency class. So I think maybe we require any mental health professional in any state that's going to provide these services for the court in conjunction with the service of a red flag law, that they are also, they need to have had cultural competency training. And if it's not the WTTA class, it's some other equivalent class where the person has an understanding of what responsible firearms ownership looks like. Because as a mental health professional, they just think having a gun increases risk, therefore it's dangerous, therefore you shouldn't have them in general. Well, then anybody the police call and say, hey, can you check this person out and tell us if they should have a gun? They already start from nobody should have a gun. That's not helpful, right? So I think cultural competency would be a way to mitigate exposure and liability and risk, that somebody actually understands what they're talking about in the niche of serving the gun community, serving the 2A culture, and understanding what responsible firearms ownership looks like. I think that would be a mitigating factor to their exposure. I will say that I have openly called for, name and tell me what happened to the mental health professional in New York that evaluated the shooter at the Buffalo grocery store, right? That person was taken in on an involuntary commitment. They were put in for observation. They were released with a green light, like, nope, you're okay to go. You're fine. They were legally able to purchase firearms after that evaluation. And then they ended up shooting up the grocery store. And I think it was like within 18 months. So was that mental health professional held accountable? Has that mental health professional even done a media interview to explain what they saw? I'm unaware of it. And I've brought this up a lot over the last few years. So while I hear the mental health professionals telling me they're concerned about this, I'm unaware of an example of mental health professionals being held accountable for having gotten the call wrong.
That makes sense. It also, there seems to be a flaw of like, all right, say the evaluation leads to that next phase. I know Jake's big on the cultural competence course with the red flags of the process to remove some of these firearms does not look the same to restore that right of firearm ownership after, to where there's a lower barrier entry to remove the firearms and then some huge mountain to climb How would you address that in this kind of new evolution of legislation?
Yeah, so in this project we're working on with Tufts University, this has come up a lot. Making sure that we have, at one point, like in the proposal, it said something like 24 hours to surrender the guns, but then up to 5. Wait a minute, if it's a 2-week order and it's not, could potentially double or add 50% to the a weekend. Now you're up to 21 days potentially. Somebody can have their firearm, and the finding of the court was no, this person can have their guns. So we do need to be aware of that. Obviously, that we changed that in our proposal and address that issue. I think here's another key point to a red flag or an emergency intervention law. We've got 100 million people in the U.S. that legally own guns. Presumably, there are a lot more that could legally own guns. I don't understand, and I don't think it's appropriate that we need the government to take control of the guns. Now, if the concern is I should be, my immediate access to firearms should be removed, well, then why can't I give them to my business partner? Why can't I give them to my best friend? Why can't I give them to my sister? As long as that isn't a prohibited person, I should have that option. So I think that has to be built in to any evolved emergency intervention rule here, where the government steps in as a civil service and says, you can do this. Kind of like, you think about, if you get a DUI, you're not allowed to drive. The government doesn't impound your car, right? So yeah. I think that kind of reasonable step would do a lot to allay the fears and concerns of gun owners, right? That yes, the government could come in, but if you give the person, the respondent, 24 hours to relinquish their access to firearms or turn that access over to someone else, does that fulfill the concern? I think it absolutely does. Now, if we go to an extreme, think about, like, let's use me as an example. If I get served with a red flag, I've got guns at my place in Florida. I've got guns at my place in North Carolina. I've got guns in my office here. I've got access to our assembly room and storage area at Avidity Arms. I've got another storage area over here where there's guns. Like, it could take 2 weeks for the government to collect all my firearms if the government's going to collect all my firearms. However, if I take that key, my America key, and I give that to somebody, and I don't have access to this locked vault room, right, where the guns are secured, doesn't that meet the requirement? And I would think it certainly does. So I think that needs to be baked in. So mandatory mental health evaluations reported back to the court, and options for removing access that don't involve the government collecting the guns, and then obviously then needing to be responsible for returning the guns at the end. I think that's important. Now, that's the physical aspect of it. If what Jake was maybe talking about was, how do we decide when someone can have their guns back? I think, again, that mental health evaluation serves the purpose. One of the other things that then becomes important, if there's a permanent order, if that order is extended from the 2-week or 10-day order to a full year, then can the individual, if they seek treatment for whatever reason, whatever the issue was, or they just work it out, again, they breathe, they meditate, they pet their dog, whatever, they come back to the court and they petition the court and say, I want to be relieved of this civil restriction to my Second Amendment rights based on this information. And if they bring in, I don't know, they write a 4-page essay on why they're cool now, or they bring in a mental health professional to testify and say, no, this guy is cool. I think there needs to be a process for that. In most cases that I'm aware of, current laws allow for the government to extend an ERPO, but they don't necessarily allow for the respondent to get one reduced in time if they're over whatever the issue was. So I think that's important. I also think it's important to fix the time and make that time an automatic restoration of rights, right? So at the end of the year, you don't have to go back for a hearing. You get your rights restored at the end of that year, unless, and the unless is putting the burden on the government to maybe within 30 days of the expiration of the order, come back into the courts and prove once again that the respondent shouldn't have access to firearms.
Yeah, that would make
Obviously,
sense.
There's this issue of, well, wait a minute, the guy's got a hammer, the guy got a knife, the guy can build bombs, right? They're with any of these rules, with any of these laws, there's an assumption of compliance, and there's an assumption of, I believe there has to be an innate assumption of a temporary nature of the problem, and that we're going to get it fixed, right? If someone goes out and like literally murking the assumption based on the way our courts work and the way our criminal justice system works, that 30 years later, they come back out, they're over it. Whatever problem was 30 years ago, they are now able to come back out into society. We know that's not always the case, but that is an assumption that our system makes. It's one of the reasons that the lifetime prohibition for gun ownership, if you commit a felony right now, doesn't make any sense, and why we should have a way to get our rights restored. And in fact, I think that your rights should be restored in an automatic way, just like you come off probation or you come out of jail after a conviction. So I think that would be the same thing for a red flag law. I think that's important as well.
Yeah, that would make a bunch of sense to re-go through the process after a set amount of time to continue to prove that this person shouldn't have access. And around the access conversation, G-Web kind of brought up a good point of why are firearms the only thing that's being removed for people that are found at risk? Maybe let's say in this hypothetical situation, they went through the mental health examination. They said, okay, this person's at risk, and firearms need to be, maybe like you say, given to X, Y, or Z individual, remove their access. Would you remove access to any other things at that point as well? Or would this proposed thing just be targeting firearms?
Yeah, I think this is the problem. And G-Webs brings it up with his question that what we have had in the past is thinly veiled gun control masquerading as, an intervention to prevent this massively bad thing from happening. And the focus on guns sort of revealed that right from the beginning. However, I have said in some conversations facetiously, well, I guess we have to remove the knives and the hammers and the chainsaws and the explosives, a can of gasoline, all that stuff from somebody's house too. And incredibly, some people on the other side of the conversation who are lobbying for red flag laws have not got that I was tongue in cheek, and they've literally come back with, "Oh yeah, that's a good point." Well, that would require a lot, wouldn't it? And it's like their brain was catching up to the fact that I was joking, maybe, but at the same time, they were realizing that what we're asking for is an impossibility. You can't really keep someone from everything that's harmful, right? Like that window, I can use, this can through that window gives me a sharp piece of glass that I can then hurt myself or hurt somebody else with, right? I mean, I could bite a chunk of this aluminum can out and have a sharp piece of metal that I could cut myself or cut somebody else with. So this idea that guns are horrible and guns are bad and guns are evil and we need to reduce people's access to guns underlies the existence of red flag laws in the traditional way they've been brought to us, right? And doesn't make any sense. So I think when you put it in those terms, a lot of people who are sincere, and when I say that, it's a gut feeling, right? People that I believe are sincere in not being anti-gun, but really wanting to do something to reduce negative outcomes involving firearms, it does sometimes dawn on them that, yeah, maybe it's not just the gun, right? If they're sincere. And that's where this mental health activity makes sense. And then if we have to do this, if we're going to respond in a way that restricts somebody's civil rights, shouldn't we just be putting them under immediate mental health care? Why are we saying 24 hours? If you've got this acute problem where the government has to come in and say, you can't have access to guns right now, why are we then saying, so you got 24 hours to bring us your guns and walking away? And that's a potential problem, right? I think it's a logic problem. It's a consistency problem. It's a hypocrisy problem. If somebody is really holding the fort on this is bad, but they're not willing to go to involuntary commitment. And that's why I always end up at involuntary commitment as the better answer for almost any plausible situation where we're really worried about, especially someone hurting other people, right? I think if we're worried about somebody hurting themselves, hey, go stay at your brother's house for the night, or hey, your sister's going to come stay with you, may be enough, right? And lock the guns up today, or disassemble the guns, right? Like take the key components out of the gun, right now. So you don't have that impulsive thing, our whole cause a pause idea that we've had it for years at Walk Talk America, right? I think there are better interventions. And that's the thing. There are better interventions. Now, suicide might be that grayer area. And suicides are give or take 50% of the firearms involved deaths every year. And we know we need to spend a lot of time there. That's where we get to the, okay, your friend called us. We're the police. We showed up. They're concerned about you hurting yourself. Oh, yeah, I called them. I was really upset. I lost my job, lost my dog, lost my truck, lost my wife. And yeah, I was upset. And so I did say that maybe I'm just not, doing any good for anybody here in the world. I have nothing left to live for, but I'm over it now. And if the police officers, maybe the mental health professional that's accompanying the police officers in some cases and saying, you know what, you're in a delicate state, my friend. We don't think it's a good idea for you to have impulsive, immediate, open access to firearms right now. Should that include razor blades? Should that include can of gasoline? Should that include big jar of painkillers? Probably. But because razor blades, and particularly the razor blades, the gasoline, these other knives or steak, that they're not regulated, there's no mechanism to come in and say, well, the government controls access to razor blades, so you can't have them now. And we're going to put a note in the system so that when you go to the Walgreens to buy another razor, it's going to come up and say, this person can't have razors this week. There's just no mechanism for it. So I do think there are people who we would want to have a 24-hour watch on, take their shoelaces, keep an eye on them, don't let the cameras die in the prison cell kind of thing. So we know what's going on with those people because the state they're in and they may hurt themselves. Does a red flag law as it exists now do enough for that? Absolutely not. Because again, you're asking them to voluntarily tell you where all the guns are, collect the guns, and you're even giving them a time frame in which to do it from the initial problem. So again, I'm back to involuntary commitment or phone a friend. Get some intervention right away, real intervention to address the underlying problem. And I don't know how you address that with law. And this is where with a lot of things in life, I don't think laws are the answer. I think a good community is the answer. I think a proactive approach to mental health care. I think an awareness, checking in on our friends, being there for our friends, being willing to do the hard thing to help a buddy out, which sometimes just means asking them if they're okay. Because you kind of know they're not. You don't want to embarrass them. You don't want to have this weird, did I trigger something negative hanging over your head? But we've got to be more involved. And the red flag laws ultimately, from a public health perspective, society is going to get involved in trying to help this person. But we know sometimes people get hurt by that. And that's the concern we've always had at WTTA. I think the official position is we want people to go seek mental health care. And if they're afraid they're going to lose their gun rights by seeking mental health care, then they're not going to seek it. And that could have really negative outcomes that are unintended by the people that are sincere in why they want red flag laws in the first place.
Yeah, for those that just joined, obviously Walk the Talk has a blog post that shows, hey, here's why we do not support red flag laws. And here's all the reasons why. Like Rob just said, there's a lot of unintended consequences that we're seeing. And G-Web had a question. I don't know if you know. I don't know of any data, but do you know of any data or research on people that hurt themselves after a red flag law was enacted on them?
Colorado has tried to do a good job, I guess, over the last 5 years since the ERPO laws have existed in following up and collecting data. You can't prove a negative, right? So while it is there is data out there which would suggest 80-90% of the people who have red flag laws served on them don't go on to commit any negative acts to themselves or others, or whatever it is. It's a huge number. It's a huge portion. But does that mean they would have anyway? And I don't think that that's the case. And I have not found very many people pushing that as a case where they're saying, okay, since 95% of the people who were served with red flags did not kill themselves or anybody else, then the red flag law must have worked. That's even a bridge too far for the people that are proponents of red flag laws to suggest, because there's no data to back up the fact that the idea that the red flag law was the only reason, the sole reason that they didn't hurt themselves. So it's trying to prove a negative. And the other side of it is, we do know that there have been there have been people who have been served red flags. There have been people who've gotten into, unfortunately, lethal altercations with law enforcement while the red flags are being served. Now, I've always said, to some level, that's an indication that something was wrong, right? When the police show up and say, hey, we've got this piece of paper, we're going to need to come into the house, we're going to need to collect your firearms, this is for your own good kind of thing. That's not the time to pull a gun on the cops. And if you're pulling a gun on the cops at that moment, maybe there was some problem underlying the reason that the red flag law was being served, right? So I hesitate, and I know that hits the wrong way for some people in the gun community. They're like, well, wait a minute, that's the tyranny, isn't it? Isn't that the exact time we're supposed to be saying, no, you can't have my guns? And I'm always like, hey, when the guy shows up with a piece of paper and says, hey, we need to have the guns, that's where you got to get your own piece of paper and you got to fight that out. No, drawing the gun on the local sheriff who's serving the red flag is not the thing to do in that moment, I don't think, right? There's some people who will disagree with that maybe that undermines the whole reason for the Second Amendment in some people's eyes. I don't think that's the moment, especially in today's society, sort of the way it works now. The concern about abuse of red flags also, kind of segue from that to, well, what do I do if it's not fair? Well, that's where there needs to be a significant penalty, and it can't just be false reporting of a crime or anything like that. There needs to be baked into any evolved red flag law. There has to be a clause that says, if someone maliciously or erroneously uses this to hurt another person, to harass another person, to deprive a person of their civil rights without justification, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's the courts, or whether it's the individual who reports the whatever the underlying concern was to the police or to the courts, depending on the structure in the state, they need to be held accountable under any red flag law, not referencing some other area of law and just saying, well, anytime you call the police and give a false report, you can be charged. This needs to be stringently built into the red flag laws to protect from abuse.
Are there any other critical things that you'd want to address? I want to spend a little time on the back of, like, how would you implement this? If there was some magical thing that we came up with and like, hey, this looks pretty good. We don't want it to be like the NIL with college athletes, if they rush something out and then it's not really working that well. But before we get there, is there any other critical components you'd want to address or add in before we look into how would you actually implement this successfully?
I think there needs to be training on the law enforcement side too. I'm not a fan of any scheme where, like, the neighbor can go to the court and say, I'm afraid this person's going to hurt themselves. Like, I think there has to be professional interaction there. So I think it needs to be the petitioner or the complainant goes to law enforcement. And then inside of, now this may not be possible in your 6-man agency in the middle of, small town Wyoming or whatever, but whenever reasonably possible, I think that an agency should have training for officers who are going to be serving these red flags or ERPOs or emergency interventions, whatever we're going to call them. So there has to be training in a sensitivity to when it's appropriate and when the other options, restraining orders, protective orders, involuntary commitments, are better options. I think there needs to be training in terms of how to have the conversation, how to do the quote unquote evaluation. I think that in a lot of agencies, there are mental health professionals that ride along or immediately available to do assessments with patrol officers out in the field. I think they need to be integrated into the process whenever possible, before the order is served or even when the order is being considered for that initial contact. I think mental health professionals should be involved as often and as early as possible. Again, Florida is doing some training. I know there are a couple organizations out there that are providing training to law enforcement specifically. I think we want to make sure that the training is saying you have other tools. This is an option of last resort. When there is no crime, there is no reason to take this person into custody. It's not rising to the level of involuntary commitment. There's no reason. There's not a complainant that can go get a protective or a restraining order on their own, and you feel compelled to do something then this might work. And here's how to do it. Certainly, I think that when it comes to the collection of firearms and how to handle that interaction, or preferably in the scheme, I would imagine would be infinitely better. The removal of firearms, how to supervise the removal of firearms to a non-prohibited trusted person that's going to keep those firearms. Maybe there's an affidavit or something they fill out and say, yeah, here's how I'm going to store them, and here's how I'm going to prevent access to the person who owns them for this temporary period. And certainly in that case, we'd want to make sure there's no civil liability there. And I think that, because of professional licensing structure from a mental health standpoint, I think for the person who is being trusted with the weapons, they need to be absolved of any potential civil liability at the end of that period of time. So when the government says, hey, you can give Jim back his guns, when they give Jim back the guns, they can't be held responsible if something bad happens 6 weeks, 6 hours, 6 months, 6 years from now, right? So I think that has to be built in there. So implementation, training for mental health, training for law enforcement, making sure that law enforcement is involved, a representative of the system is involved. That brings up another thing that people talk about with the due process piece. Sometimes they say, well, it's not fair because the respondent isn't being provided with a lawyer. We have to remember that these are civil situations. So there's no obligation on the behalf of the government to provide legal counsel free of charge because it's not a criminal action. However, I do think one of the things that I've heard proposed, and I think is a great idea, that organizations like USCCA, Second Call Defense, CCW Safe, all of these organizations that are involved in helping people with the legal aftermath of defensive firearms use, they could certainly provide a list of either funded representation or, for members of their organizations, or I'm sure there are lawyers out there who are willing to represent people in especially denser population areas pro bono. So in other words, here's a list of lawyers you can call at a reduced rate or pro bono free or provided by CCW Safe, USCCA, Second Call Defense, Armed Citizens Defense League, all of the ones that are out there. I absolutely think that responding to a red flag or ERPO service should be something that's covered underneath of those policies and those memberships. At least, add $10 a year or add $5 a year, whatever it is. If somebody wants to include that, I think it would make sense. If you're taking the USCCA membership, maybe you throw the extra $5 or $10 on, or the organization decides it's worth the extra effort to also provide representation in these situations. Again, just to keep everybody in check, to make sure that these laws aren't going into places, aren't being used in places abusively.
What would be the timeline if a bill like this got greenlit? You mentioned all the different trainings, all the different professionals that need to be educated on when to use it, how to use it, the different tools. Would it be like 6 months, a year for all that training to take place before then it's put into place, or what timeline would you see like that?
I don't know. Those are a lot of those. Sometimes I feel like I'm supposed to answer those or like make up answers to those kinds of questions, but it's like, I don't know, right? Like how long it takes is how long it takes. If in other words, I would put the law in place. If I were magically writing this law, if I was burdened with, we have to have this law, Rob, but you get to write it. Well, then I'm going to include a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And I'm going to say this training is required prior to implementation. So now the burden is on the system, right? The government that wants to put this law into place needs to figure it out. Now, mental health professional training is pretty easy, right? Because you come to WTTA.org and you go online, you take the cultural competency course. For law enforcement, like I said, I know that person's out there doing it. Maybe a state's going to come up with their own program. Maybe it takes 6 months. Maybe it takes a year. I don't know, but I do know that it should be a requirement. And if you have that as a requirement, now the burden is on the agency, the organization, the state, the legislature to provide that timeline, to provide the funding to make it happen. And if it doesn't happen, well, then the law never goes into place, because without those protections, without those trainings in place, then I think that we have what we have already, which is these potentially abusive, unfair, thinly veiled gun control red flag laws.
How much do you think a priority is from the two-way side to get together and try to think up of some type of alternative solution like we're talking about, versus all the, like you said, I think earlier, of red flags laws are coming. They're all going to keep proposing. How much of a priority should the two-way community have towards coming together to build something like this?
Well, I think those two things are inseparable. I think that our responsibility is to be proactive in our approach to mental health care and to look out for each other and to encourage people to do the best practices, right? Like I've got the Guns and Mental Health podcast sticker on my safe across the room, and I've got a picture of my daughters and my granddaughter on it. I got my cause a pause there, right? Like I've got my things in place personally. I reach out to people. I advocate for WTTA. I advocate for mental health professionals take our color for competency course. Like I think all of those things are what we have an obligation to do. But on the other side of that is we don't have an obligation to call the legislature and say, here's what we propose. But I do think it's smart to be in the room when those conversations are happening because they are coming. So if we know that the red flag law is going to be proposed in every legislature in the country that doesn't already have a red flag law, I think it's up to us to be in those rooms, to be in those hearings, not just to pound on the table and say these are unfair, we don't want them, but to explain why they're unfair and why we don't want them. And I think the fear for a lot of people is, well, wait a minute, Rob, if we go into the room and we say our problem is there's no mental health activity around this, it's just taking the guns. And then they come back and say, okay, we'll put mental health activity in there. Mandatory mental health evaluation has to be reported to the court within 10 days of the service of an ERPO. And now we're like, oh man, they got us. Now we have to support it. Well, be thorough, right? Like when you make your objection, you have to make your objection in a rational way that covers everything you want covered. And then, at the end of it, I mean, if you go into any negotiation with someone, you say, well, I'll sell you my business if you do this and you keep the employees on and you pay me a consulting fee for the next 3 years. And they say, okay, here's a check, here's the contract, and here's the contracts for all your employees. And you turn around and say, never mind, not good enough. Well, then you're a bad negotiator, right? Like that's not cool. So if we're going to walk in that room and have a list of things, we need to make sure that list of things is comprehensive. We need to be able to explain and if it's well thought out, and if it's well planned, and if it really makes sense to you, then at the end of the day, you're supporting whatever this thing is. And I have a hard time even saying the sentence, you're supporting a red flag law, because you're not, in this case, what I'm envisioning, you're not supporting red flag laws as we had them in the past. You're supporting this evolved thing that might actually get some people some help and placate the concerns of those from outside the gun community that are perfectly happy with the old red flag laws. That's what we want to get away from. And to naively just put our head in the sand and say, well, red flag laws are bad, so I don't want them. And I don't think my state will ever get one. I think that's a naive approach. Colorado have shown us that we're like one bad event in any state from unfair gun restrictions. Ready with the reasonable middle ground of, okay, we understand there's negative aspects to firearms being in the world. We want to help prevent those negative outcomes, and therefore we propose this. And for people that are living in states that already have red flag laws, your job, right, your opportunity is to go into the legislature and propose amendments, propose changes. You can go in and say repeal the red flag law, but I think you got a much stronger footing if you go in and say, here's how the red flag law should be amended. Here are the provisions that need to be added, or here's the things that need to be changed. Here's the things that need to be taken away from this old-fashioned gun control red flag law to move forward into this space where we might actually help people and not unfairly burden them.
Yeah, it's cool to see the perception shift a little bit of what, maybe 4 years ago, anytime Mike spoke at an event that people thought he shouldn't be at, there's all kinds of comments on social media, but now there seems to be more support of giving that perspective. Like you say, maybe you're laughing, maybe you're not quite getting as much love and support from those people and still getting the hate, but it just seems important because, like you even mentioned, of how would someone restrict access to firearms for you with all the different ways that this legislation isn't really written with somebody like you in mind. So when you're coming in there and say, hey, as a gun industry professional, I have all this access, like you wouldn't want to trigger some crisis just by saying, Rob, your career in the 2A industry is done just because of this. Have solutions and keep those individuals in mind as well. Looks like
I mean, this is a 3D printed firearm, right? Like everything here is 3D printed or hardware store bought, right? There's nothing in here that I need to go even to a gun shop to buy, let alone, or a website that sells gun parts. Like this is all. So the question: are you going to take away my 3D printer? Are you going to follow me around and not let me go to Home Depot? I just think that there's some real naivete on the side of the people that want to do the right thing and think just snap a finger and tell somebody they have to surrender their firearms and all of a sudden nothing bad's going to happen. Like that's naive. And that's why red flag laws at a baseline are not doing any good. It's feel good. It's like that worst kind of feel good legislation where it's hurting some people. It's getting in the way of some people doing the right thing. And yet it's not even accomplishing the goal. I don't think that the most sincere people, the people that can care most about gun rights, the kind of people that I think are the audience, part of why I think we don't get as much pushback at this point is we've curated an audience for WTTA. The people that are like hate on what WTTA does, they probably don't show up as much anymore because it just, fatigue. You eventually win, right? I've been doing this for a long time, right? Well over 20 years, very much in the public space, and for over 30 years professionally. I have worn down a lot of the haters, right? Now I get new haters every week or two, right? Somebody new will show up, like it hasn't gotten the memo that I don't care, that I'm outside of the traditional rhetoric on 2A rights a lot of times, but they don't usually last. So there's still, but the vast majority, I think, of the gun community still has a gut reaction to red flag laws are bad, and they're right. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be in the room having a conversation about why they're bad and how we might actually be able to take some steps as a community and as a society in a larger perspective of how we can reduce negative outcomes involving firearms, because that benefits everybody. I do think in the long run and in the short run, fewer negative outcomes involving firearms benefits gun owners, it benefits society at large, it benefits the gun industry. Like it just makes Earth better.
G-Web kind of has a question, I think, along the line of this topic of how do we get like you, Mike, and others into those conversations more. His is the 2022 federal gun control called Safer Communities Act, incentivize red flag laws with federal funding over a number of years. Would any of this work give WTTA access to any of those funds?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of different pieces of funding that are potentially available under the SAFE Act. So I had a conversation with there were two guys that were the co-directors of the White House's gun control office, whatever they called it. They called it something else. But the guys that were responsible for the Safer Communities Act, they were at a research conference that Mike and I both attended last December. And I went up and had a conversation with them. One of them was willing to have the conversation. The other one snuck away as fast as he could to take some selfies with gun grabbers. The other guy actually had the conversation with me. And of course, it's like, oh, well, we had no idea that, there were people in the gun community that would be involved in that would be interested in having those conversations, which is disingenuous. Like it's intellectually dishonest. Like we're out here, we're waving our hands, we're saying we're here, come talk to us. Mike will go to this conference, I'll go to that event. This project that we talked more about it last week. People can go back and check out that podcast we put out 10 days ago or so. But this project that I'm working on with Tufts University, we got about 3 months left. I got invited into that room. David Yamane, BJ Campbell, Laura Smith with LGC. Like there are definitely people who are prominent or known in the gun community who have been invited into that conversation. There have been a lot of other conversations. What we are seeing less of is less of the, let's say, standardized, we won't talk to them attitude. And that was first and foremost, 15, 20 years ago saying, we're not even going to have we're not going to go on CNN. We're not going to have a conversation with, I don't know, who's a liberal left leaning, Rachel. We're not going to have a conversation with Rachel Maddow. We're not going to we're not even going to support a state level Democrat who's pro-gun because they're associated with federal gun control agenda, big D Democratic presidential nominees. And I think when we shut those doors as a community, I say we as a community, when we shut those doors, it makes it very easy for someone who's really new to this, who just says, well, I paid my NRA membership. I'm a proud gun owner. I support the Second Amendment. When they see somebody like me step out of that ideological purity, we're not going to talk to them. And I go over here to try to have a conversation so they maybe understand us better and understand what we see as the flaws in their approaches. Well, then it's easy to be attacked. For somebody to say, wait a minute, we don't do that. Why are you doing that? And it's taken time to get people to understand that, well, we've done a lot in the gun community to say, oh, look, we let women shoot, or we let people of color shoot. We let people with different sexualities shoot. What we don't do generally is let people with different ideas shoot. We really do like our ideological purity in the community when it comes to Second Amendment. Pounding on the table saying shall not be infringed was like the only acceptable answer for a long time. And we've evolved past that. And the success of Walk the Talk America since 2018 is a clear indicator of that, right?
Yeah, and it's been encouraging to see that Walk the Talk's been included in grants as kind of a subcontractor. Who knows if they'll get accepted, but now we're getting included into some of those funding things to play a role in research and messaging and make things play out more smoothing. We just submitted we're involved in a proposal submitted earlier this month. We'll see if it gets accepted, but we're getting a seat at the table finally, and that's encouraging.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I don't know if there were any other questions in the chat or you had anything specific. I'm coming up on another meeting, but I know we wanted to do this follow-up to dig really deeply into ERPOs and some of the conversations that are happening with this Tufts level or state level policy conversation with Tufts and other people. I appreciate you filling in for Mike and taking the helm here. And I'm sure he's resting up after a busy week that he had representing WTTA in Shreveport, Louisiana.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Rob, and diving down this fun little thought exercise of what might some legislation that Walk the Talk and you would be supportive of look like. And enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you to all of our partners to make these conversations possible. And as always, we wish you better mental health.